In this video, I will be going over the concept and process of UV layout in Maya. This is designed as a beginner's introduction and will not cover all tools available for UV layout, but should be enough to get you started. In the last video, I constructed a high poly wooden crate as a study and a simplified low poly version that will receive my textures. Before I can begin the process of making my textures in Photoshop, I will need to unfold the surface of my model in a two-dimensional space so that an image can be applied to it. To lay out my UVs, I will need to open the UV editor. It can be found in several places, one of which is under Window, UV Editor. Just as three-dimensional objects exist on the X, Y, and Z axes, the two-dimensional aspects of our model exist on the U and V axes. The space exists in tandem, but separately from the 3D space. Changes made to the UVs will affect the surface of the objects, but not the three-dimensional shape. First, let's take a look at the UV editor itself. In the main viewport of the UV editor, we can see that it is broken up into 4 distinct quadrants. While working with our UVs, our goal will be to lay out our UVs in the top right quadrant. As well as the main workspace, we have access to a variety of tools, both through drop-downs and through icons at the top section of the UV editor. Hovering our mouse over any of these tools will give us an idea of what the tool is. Some tools worth noting are the rotate tools that will rotate your selection in 45-degree angles, the flip selection, which will allow you to reverse your UV shells in either the U or the V directions. As well, the toggle shaded UV display option will allow for your UV shells to appear as a solid shape, making it more easy to view them. And the display checkered tiles option will not only give you the ability to see the shape and size of your shell in the 2D space based upon a grid, but it will also show up on your model for reference. Just like being able to manipulate our model in the primary viewport, in the UV viewport, we have access to the various components of the model. In this particular space, UVs will be the primary mode of interaction and can be manipulated on their own, or by double-clicking, you can select an entire shell. Now, as we can see, based on the distorted grid that has appeared upon our mesh, the UVs have not been laid out yet. To showcase what is going on, let's first take a look at what the UV layout of a default prefab cube looks like. Then, by comparing to our box, we can see that the UV layout has remained the same. While I have done various operations to my model to acquire the shape that I want, the UVs existing in their own separate space have not been affected. The primary method of organizing these UVs is to use what is called projection. Under the UV tab, we are presented with a few options as to how we can lay out our UVs. First of which is automatic mapping, which is a useful tool for quickly organizing and seeing what faces are available in your model, but will rarely result in an ideal finished layout. As well, we're presented with cylindrical, planar, and spherical mapping, each of which will essentially take a picture of the surface of your object based around a certain type of projection. The simplest and primary function that we will be using will be the planar projection. Now, before I use this, I would like to go ahead and click on the square to the right to bring up the settings. Without doing so, the operation will be done based on whatever direction it was previously projected from, which in this case is the direction of my perspective camera, and that will not be ideal for my purposes. Starting off with the box itself, not worrying about the cross beams yet, I would like to take a look at what doing a planar projection on a section of my model will do for me. By selecting particular components of my model, rather than selecting the whole model, I can take and project, allowing myself to break apart this particular section from the rest of the model and work with it more clearly in my UV space. To do so, I will go ahead and bring back up my planar mapping options. And in this case, because it is being looked down upon by the y-axis, I will do my projection from the y-axis. On the right, we can see that the section that these faces had been a part of have now been reorganized into the space, taking up the entire space, but are being much more readable visually, especially in our 3D viewport. Now, one thing that is a little bit off about this particular section is that the faces along the interior here, because they are flat in the Y direction, they exist in the UV space currently simply as lines because they are compressed on top of themselves. The first method that we can do to expose or unfold this section would be to select the face associated with the center section of my box. And new to Maya 2016 is the ability to select and manipulate objects in the UV space in its 3D world counterparts. So in this case, if I were to use my scale tool, I can take this particular face and scale it in. And as I do so, take a look at the left-hand side of the screen, and you will see that the layout of my objects is changing based on its position here. Now, there is some distortion that is occurring based on this layout because these square faces here are angled in my UV editor. Now, a way that this can be remedied is by making my UV layout more involving, but for now, given that this will eventually have just a wood grain across it, this level of UV layout will be sufficient for what we'll be doing. As I go on, I will be taking other sections of my model and applying a similar treatment to the projection. Now, having projected the bottom in the y-axis, and because I have my shaded UV display turned on, we can see that the UV layout is actually red. Now, the reason for this is because the projection of the UVs from the top reveals the backside of the faces. In my UV layout, my goal is to have all of the faces facing the correct direction, which in this case I would like to have them all blue so that I am looking at the front of them. To take the shell that I have currently selected and make it facing the correct direction, I will utilize the flip UV button at the top, and it will flip my UV shell horizontally. Now, just like before, if I select the face in the center and I scale this down using my previous shell as a guide for how I want to position this, I now have two UV shells laid out, one for the top and one for the bottom. Currently, they both exist on top of one another, and After I go through and I lay out each of my other sides, I will then go on to making them no longer overlap. So just as the top and bottom, I will be taking the sides and projecting them from their appropriate directions. Now that all 6 sides of my object are laid out and unfolded, I now need to go about laying them out, evenly distributing them inside of this UV space. One thing to note about UV layout is that the space that you are using is a finite resource. Textures are pixel-based, and therefore utilizing as much of the space as possible will result in the best quality of images. In order to work with my UVs that I currently have, I'm going to select them all in UV mode, and I am going to go up to Polygons, and I'm going to choose Layout. Now, this function is automated and will try to do its best to get each of the UV shells laid out within the UV space. And for simple shapes like this, we are left with a very usable amount of space. In more complex objects, this function can be unideal in the way that it lays things out, so be careful. Given that I have 6 sides to my box, without having any of the faces overlapping one another, this is the best use of the space that I have. Now, because there is a large section, about a third of my UV space, still open, this gives me a perfect place to start laying out my boards. One way that I can do this is to UV each section. Alternatively, I have the ability to UV one board because each of the sections around it are duplications of the same board, UVing it once and then duplicating it to replace the previous boards so that I only have to conduct the UVing operation for this piece one time. Just like the box, I'm going to go ahead and select the components of this object, which in this case is just these 3 faces. And I will again do a planar projection, in this case from the top, from the y-axis. Now, in order to expose or unfold the sides of this object, I'm going to go ahead and select them in edge mode. And just like when widening my boards, I will take these 2 edges and reposition them so that they are visible to our object. By sliding them up, I see that I have a slightly distorted shape here. So by finding the correct direction to make these shapes more accurate, I will do so. As stated before, because I only want to do this UVing operation one time, then rearrange my UVs, I will now take this as an opportunity to duplicate and reuse the pieces that I've made. Now that all of my pieces have been duplicated, it's time to take what I have and lay them out accordingly based upon the original shape. The size of the grid gives you a good indication of the size of a shell compared to other shells. In my case, I want to take all of the UV shells for the cross beams, rotate them, and scale them down to a size that's appropriate to that of the rest of my model. Now that I have each of the pieces constructed and put into place, I can now take each of the shells and rearrange them so that they no longer overlap. As well as having the UV mode or face mode, in the UV editor, shell mode is an option that will allow you to select and move an entire shell at a time. Though I have not used 100% of my UV space, the layout is as ideal as I am able to get without overlapping my faces. In the next video, I will be going over how to take what we've done with our object, export it out into an image, and begin to start working on things in Photoshop. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.